Thanks for joining us. This is the Aspen City Council work session for March 28th, 2022. Tonight's work session agenda is about the moratorium. We have one item, moratorium, public engagement update, and growth management.
Mr. Mayor and Council, thanks for your time this evening, or this afternoon. 3 o'clock here in Aspen, Colorado. Joined with me at the table, Philip Sapino, Community Development Director, and Jessica Guerra of Design Workshop. And we're here to have a discussion about two really distinct topics this evening, certainly related, of course, in response to the moratorium. But we're going to be talking about what we've done so far and what we've heard so far related to public engagement and outreach. And then we're going to shift gears into one of the, I'd say, more technical responses that we're making in response to the moratorium on the topic of demolition. So with that, if it'd be okay, I'd like to share my screen.
Of course.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So we're going to start the conversation this evening around public outreach and engagement to date. Included in your packet is Exhibit A. Was a fairly lengthy document that I think gave both high level and then sort of granular detail about the things that we've heard, the events that have been held, the efforts that have been made to date. So lots of detail in your packet, and we're going to talk about some of that on a high level, talk about some of the key findings that have come out of the outreach to this point, and then certainly give you a chance to ask us any questions of the things that we've heard so far, or the process that we've engaged in. And then we wanted to give a little bit of an update about our plans for the next round of outreach and engagement as we get into April. Okay, so this is cut off a little bit, but I think it's just fine. This, I think, gives you a little bit of a sense of the outreach and engagement efforts as they align with the work that's happening behind the scenes with staff and the consultants in terms of policy formation, policy analysis, data analysis, and what's eventually going to come out of this process in terms of potential code amendments. And so running parallel to that stuff that's happening back of house on the right, on the left in the darker blue are the things that have been happening to this date on engagement and outreach. We are sort of midstream. We've got this report that's coming to council this evening. Following this, as we continue the policy drafting and code updates, we're going to be launching into a second round of more formal public engagement efforts as we get into mid-April. And then coming back to you to keep you updated on the things that we're hearing from the public as we get towards more specific policy and code responses. This is a graphic that I lifted directly from the report, and it was striking to me that we've held 30 very formal, deliberate engagement efforts, some of them one-on-one interviews, but particularly as we got into that sort of intensive week in March, a lot of planning, a lot of time, a lot of effort to try to have good conversations with different groups within the public, both generally and then more specifically with technical stakeholders. Between February 8th and March 24th, we've talked to more than 280 people, active participants across Aspen Community Voice, stakeholder interviews, focus groups, and then the pop-up events that we held during that week. The biggest numbers of those pop-up events came from events that we held on the pedestrian mall, but across those we had good conversations with people and feel like we, in the time that we've had to this point, have had some really good conversations with folks in a variety of different venues. This is again a graphic from Exhibit A, giving some data points and some of the numbers that relate to the efforts that have been made to this point. Again, just across a lot of different platforms, Aspen Community Voice, which has the most detailed information for members of the public who are trying to catch up with this process to this point. Aspen Community Voice is probably the most detailed place to get the information that you might be looking for. But we've had advertisements across our 2 local newspapers, active on Twitter and Facebook, Instagram. The newsletters that we have had access to, ACRA has had some coverage. ComDev newsletters have been pretty regularly discussing this topic. And then in preparation for that event, kind of week in March, hundreds of event mailers for specific neighborhoods for these different events. And then we've had really great news coverage in Aspen Times, Aspen Daily News, and Aspen Public Radio. So again, I think this comment has been made. I think that if you haven't been somehow contacted by advertising for these events or for this public outreach efforts, I think you haven't been looking, because we've been pretty thorough in our coverage across different platforms. Some of the key findings, and I think these were the consultant team did a really nice job of summarizing, this large number of comments that we have heard to date, and broke them down into different topic areas. And I've just got a couple slides that recount some of those things. I think lots of comments around affordable housing development, that some of which are quite obvious in Aspen. It's not hard to understand that we have a barrier related to cost in terms of the development of affordable housing. But we heard that regularly from folks. People acknowledge that as one of the things we're facing. To, I think, more nuanced discussions or easier alternatives to building affordable housing. We had comments around that. There was clear agreement, and I think we gave some statistics in the outreach document. People think that affordable housing in general should be allowed across town, regardless of zone district, regardless of location, with the caveat, and we talked about this with council a couple of weeks ago, that affordable housing fits into the scale and the context of the surrounding neighborhood. One of the things we did hear from a couple of folks that I think is interesting to council's larger discussions around affordable housing and the Affordable Housing Strategic Plan is that there was some strong statements that they feel that we, before we launch into significant efforts around affordable housing, that we should come up with a targeted number of the number of units that we're looking for. And I think that's a conversation that's being happening outside of the moratorium conversation, but there are members of the community that feel that those are definitely related topics that we need to discuss. This next slide is partially around the topic that we're talking about in the second half of the presentation this evening. We asked some very pointed questions about deconstruction versus demolition. Those terms are pretty close to each other, but deconstruction means that you kind of thoughtfully deconstruct a house, separate it out into its component elements, and then recycle and reuse what you can, as opposed to taking a front-end loader and putting it into a dump truck and taking it to the landfill. I think that in general, we get a sense that the days of that happening are coming to an end because of market forces and things that are happening at the landfill. But we do think that there was some clear consensus from the folks that we're talking to that as much as we can to kind of incentivize that deconstruction process. Lots of conversations around the thresholds for demolition. That's going to be a topic a little bit later this afternoon. We heard from members of the development community that the demolition calculation methodology that we currently use is complicated and difficult to get through, and then also has unintended consequences associated with it. And there's, without a doubt, these very complex, large-scale projects have increased over the last couple of years, without a doubt. And people, I think, both in the public and the development community kind of acknowledge that. I think they're coming at it from different directions, but I think there's acknowledgement that there's a pace of things that are happening in town that is on a new level. Certainly, acknowledgement that the new homes that are being built are increasingly complex, have a higher valuation for sure. That's showing up in building permit data. When we got into the conversation on home sizes, though, the outcomes and the things that we heard were pretty nuanced. And, I think there was some statistics in the report that just 26% of the people who we talked to, who weighed in on it, felt that home size and the size and scale of homes was appropriately scaled at this point. But then after that, it became pretty nuanced of what people thought around that topic, and so we're trying to get through that. Yes, sir.
Just real quick, so you're saying 26% of people thought that the home size were appropriate now. That means 74% felt that they weren't?
There was, I think, another 46% or so that felt that they were not, and then after that number is where people are like, well, but maybe if then some sort of variation of that nuance. And, I think it's something that we certainly need to parse out a little bit more. But I think it's in line with the conversations that we've had with council about how we're thinking about home size. I think people have different opinions about it, and I think people think about real estate in Aspen maybe differently than they do in other places in the country, or kind of understand that, we do have a portion of our visitors and residents who want, homes of this size. And so I think it's representative of that spectrum of response.
And so, just to be clear, are some of these respondents members?
Can't be heard. Is your mic on?
It's on.
It's on. Sorry.
Got a note from Shannon for you on WebEx.
Sorry about
Talk
that.
like this into the microphone.
My question was, are some of the participants in this study, are they in the development community?
Yes.
Okay, so I think that's an important thing to note.
I would maybe add that when we went out to the community and asked these questions, we had them on a spectrum. And this particular question was one that maybe had more diversity in opinion, which I think is why we've concluded it really is a nuanced conversation and deserves a decent amount of attention.
I can understand why.
We're trying to get clear on how WebEx, and my microphone's off, but on how WebEx may be doing.
On.
WebEx, test 1, 2. WebEx,
Mr.
test 1, 2.
Mayor, this is Sarah. WebEx is fine, except it appears that perhaps John's microphone was not on during his comments.
Thank you, God.
It's green.
I know, I love the voice of God feature. It's the best part of the new room.
Say something now and see if they can hear you.
Testing. Testing, 1, 2, 3. Can you hear me?
Amy hear you.
Sarah,
Okay.
Sarah, did you hear John? Because we also heard that Tori can't be heard when he speaks. Sarah, did you hear John just do a testing?
No, I did not.
John, you want to try the mic next to you? See if you can just turn that on.
And actually, two mics together may cancel each other out.
Mine's off.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Sarah, John just asked if you could hear from that microphone.
No, I could not.
Okay.
If John used this microphone, could you hear him?
I can, that one's working.
Yes, I would hear him.
There you go.
Come on down.
Guess let's try this one once more. Anyone?
Is this on? No.
Don't hear it?
Right.
Move over to Ward's.
Sarah, did you hear Tori ask if you could hear him?
Let me check this one, then we can all just scooch. Sarah, can you hear me on this one?
Yes, that one works.
I'll sit here.
I can hear Skippy. I cannot
Yes,
hear
check,
Tori.
check.
Jim,
not even in
under
room.
the table right there is a connection box.
You want to sit on that one and John can sit on
Might
that
be
one?
worth having someone who's interested in making sure nothing's disconnected
We're
in
just
there.
going to move over a little and
It always does.
Check. Yep. Thank you.
wait a minute, John.
Hello? That works.
Gonna go back over there.
They weren't plugged in?
It's just the controller
returned.
didn't have them on. All right, we should be good.
unfortunately, Ben's been doing most of the talking, and if you want to repeat your question, John.
Okay, I'll repeat the question. I was just curious if some of the participants in this study were members of the development community.
Yes, they were.
Thank you.
Jessica, if you want to add yours again now.
Oh, yeah. What I would say is on this question as it related to home size, we asked all of our questions on a spectrum, and this was one that had maybe more diversity in opinion. There wasn't a whole bunch on one end or the other. And so it really is a nuanced conversation. I think that was also something we heard quite a bit in our focus groups with the development community.
We heard, I think, connected to home scale and the concerns around environmental demolition, energy use, that zone of questions. We asked some questions specifically around waste and utilities, and certainly whether it be water, whether it be electricity, common consensus that we, one, need to have development consistent with our future infrastructure, and two, that we all understand that these resources are limited and becoming increasingly so, and development should recognize that increasing scarcity that we're facing. Certainly, there's a clear understanding in the community that the Pickens County landfill is got a limited lifespan, and that we should be doing things to kind of extend that lifespan as much as possible. And then lastly, I think that the big thing that we took away is that kind of in this sort of impactful development context, making sure that we are limiting the amount of waste that goes into the landfill from residential development.
Ben, just to help me contextualize
Yeah.
all the answers. So Pickens County landfill is nearing capacity. We already knew that. When it ends up in key findings, does that mean without being seeded, that was the feedback that was coming in?
I think, we had a lot of different conversations and have had a lot of different conversations with different people who come at these topics from different places. Some of these were, the number of dots on a poster asking about the specific question around, Pickens County landfill and how important that was. But I think this is a sort of an aggregation of the things that we heard in interviews, the things that we heard in focus group discussions, and then the things that we heard, on the pedestrian mall as we asked people to kind of vote with dots. It's kind of an aggregation of those conversations.
And with respect to the concept of sort of seeding, yes, we were providing information to people that we've got, 5 to 7 years left on the landfill. And we're also having focus group conversations with groups of people who are all well aware of and fluent in those dynamics, right? And so it's a question of providing the information or the setting in which you need to get meaningful feedback on the policy issues from people. Sometimes that means giving them data points. Sometimes that means having a sort of correlated conversation and arriving at the relationship between the landfill and residential development dynamics.
Got it. Gracias.
So we're happy to have, as much conversation both around our process, and I've got a slide to kind of conclude this topic, process and any kind of findings or outcomes of the specific things that we heard from folks. But where we are in this process now is that staff has got our heads down and we're kind of doing response to the things that we've heard from council to this point, the things that we've heard from the community to this point. We're going to be, and kind of our landing, and are going to be landing even more specifically on policies and specific things that we're going to be proposing in terms of code amendments. But we're going to be going out to the public again, April 13th through 15th. We're going to be holding some focus groups, both with technical stakeholders, people in the development community, people who understand the land use code really well and understand these issues maybe better than the average person walking around the street in Aspen. But we're also going to be bringing in folks that are non, members of that community, but who have kind of had specific conversations with us, have a specific interest in mind, as they're sort of navigating these issues, as we all are. And then the last week of April, on the schedule that we currently have set up, we're going to be coming to you with first reading of ordinances on the 26th of April, and then coming back to you in early May for second reading. At least that's how it's being proposed at this moment, and where we think we're going to be kind of landing. And we're going to be having an open house and at least one pedestrian mall pop-up between the first and second reading, just to kind of give information to the public about where we're landing on these different topics. And if they have interest, they can show up at the public hearing on, as we're considering second reading. So that's what we've got. Oh, and also we've got a lot of information and ways to comment on the topics at hand on Aspen Community Voice, and we'll be getting more and more content up on that as we get closer to ordinance. Okay. And then lastly, again, we're happy to engage in as much conversation as council desires, answer any of your questions, both about process or outcomes that we've heard so far. But with that, I think Philip's got some concluding remarks on this topic, but again, we're happy to answer questions either high level or kind of in the weeds on anything that we heard or the process to this point.
Ben and I, throughout this process, have repeated some concepts to council at the beginning of some of our presentations, and one of those were some of the constraints that we felt like this process was subject to. Outreach in particular, I think, was subject to some of those constraints. The wickedness of the problems, the sort of contentiousness of some of the issues, the divisiveness around those issues. And one of the things that I learned through this process, and I think that has borne out in the research that we've done and the conversations that we've had, is something that's not captured in the findings so much, but I feel like is instructive. And I'll go back to the mountain migration report that Cass put together, a year ago now. Our community has undergone a significant amount of change in the last 2 years, 4 years. A statistic I heard in one of our one-on-one interviews was that the Upper Valley, including the county, has between $4 and $6 billion worth of new owners. That phrasing was instructive to me. $4 to $6 billion worth of new owners in the last 3 to 5 years. Those are people who have not participated in the community conversation around the S-curves, the community conversation around building the hospital, around annexing Highlands, or around affordable housing that goes back 50 years. And there's a degree to which their new presence in the community is a barrier to us in trying to have a nuanced, detailed conversation about topics that may be new to them, that may be foreign to them, or that they don't have the history on, that a lot of members of our community absolutely do have. I heard numerous comments from people who said that they felt disconnected from these issues, that they didn't understand the relationship between affordable housing or the environment or residential construction dynamics and their experience as a resident in our community. For somebody who's been doing this in this town for a while and who's been doing this professionally for a long time, that was new for me. I didn't have a great response for that, and I know that some of our other staff members felt that oftentimes we had to take a number of steps back before we could get to a place where we were having the level of discussion on these topics that was necessary to feel like we were going to be able to feed council and the community the robust, detailed information that you would need to make decisions on these topics. And a question that I have, which I don't have a great answer to, but I think is important for understanding and putting into context the next work, the work we'll be doing for the next 5 weeks, is whether we've reached a point in the community with respect to that delta between the number of new residents we have in town who either don't have the information or don't feel the connection to these topics, and those that do, whether we've reached a point where some more community education is necessary. And that education was not something that we had the resources or the time or the capacity to engage in I think a way that in retrospect has been maybe necessary in a lot of ways during the last 4 months worth of work that staff's been doing. So again, nothing particularly actionable there, and I wish that I was presenting solutions to you, but again, this is a dynamic that has influenced my thinking about the community, has influenced our responses in terms of the regulations that we believe council will be seeing in the next few weeks, and something that organizationally and community-wide, I think warrants some discussion about how we engage with and expect people to be able to engage with us on some of these topics.
You know, I find that to be a really great observation and something that all of us should take to heart in any number of ways, whether we're the CEO of a nonprofit or, you know, someone running a business or just a local in town who's kind of been used to the way things are or the community approach over the past 40 years. And, you know, not to get too dramatic, but if you've ever read the book Collapse by Jared Diamond, in one of the main of the 6 root causes of collapse that he identifies is trying to bring your old lifestyle to a new location. And they were trying to raise cattle on Greenland and better off eating walruses and sheep or goats, you know, and that's part of why they starve. So it has struck me over this weekend, or actually last week when I was in this conference on watersheds and fire, and the story of the Hiflinger house being bought for $30 million and selling 3 months later for $50 million. You know, was a little bit of a conversation starter with people who saw that. And it made me think, you know, that the value we've created through mass transit, through open space, through affordable housing, through childcare, this value is something that people recognize and are willing to say, oh, I'll pay $20 million more than you paid for 3 months ago because that's a great place to be. But as you're saying, do people recognize the very components that have made it the great place to be and the compromises and perhaps sacrifices that sometimes go along with those? So on the one hand, it made me pretty happy. It's like, you know, especially having been at the table for close to 30 years, that we've, you know, seen this appreciation of value in a very unique community. On the other hand, of course, that's part of the problem that's driving all the regular locals or remaining upper middle income families out of our community. But what I was thinking is that this is something that we should really tackle post-moratoria. I don't know that we have time now. But the very chapter, no, I know we don't, but the very chapters in the Aspen Area Community Plan, you know, the introductions would make great newspaper series to go out with pictures and use those as, this is what we decided in 1993, and that's what's taken us to here. This is what we decided in 2022. That's what's taken us to here. This is why you wanted to buy here. These are the things that have created a community that have made you want to buy here. And just try to think about how we could do that post-moratoria. Those are my thoughts on it. Thank you.
John?
I just want to point out how lucky we are to live in a town that's got 2 daily newspapers. I think both papers have actually done a really good job of explaining our moratorium issues and the entrance to Aspen issues. Just giving context to what we're dealing with and how we got here and where do we go from here. I agree with what Rachel said about Collapse. That's an excellent book, and I don't know if you saw today's paper, but there's a gentleman named Richard Powers who's giving a talk about his latest book at the Pepke tomorrow night. He wrote a Pulitzer Prize winner called Overstory that I highly recommend everybody. It's about trees. But his latest book sounds really intriguing, and he actually mentions my father-in-law, James Salter, in this article. But I'm going to read a quote of his. My ideal now is to write a book that is so deeply engages a person that when they finish the book, they don't want to merely put up with the things that are wrong in the world, he said. They want to change their own story, and they want to change the story of the neighborhood around them. And I think anybody who wants to get engaged here in town, our new residents, as you pointed out, seems like we have a broader percentage of new residents than maybe at any time in our history. I don't know if that's true or not, but it feels that way. I'd just advise all our new residents to please read our local papers. Thank you.
So again, any discussion or clarifications about the work that's been done, the work that we're planning on doing as it relates to outreach?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions, and then I'll follow up on that last piece, which I appreciate you guys bringing forward as well. Yeah, it can feel so anecdotal right now, right? Because we don't have the hard data, so it's nice when you're like in this concentrated piece to bring that forward. Just a couple questions. So first one is like in the totality of the 280, who is showing up and who's absent?
Really good question. We have really taken what I would say is a two-prong approach to engagement. One is targeted at neighborhoods, more open, kind of more general community feedback. Those were all of our pop-up events. And we saw a broad range of people participating in those pop-up events. We had longtime locals come and provide some comments. We had some visitors walk by, not really, participate, but really interested in what the issues were, and so asked a lot of questions and had some feedback of how much they loved coming to Aspen and that the scale was really nice. I mean, that was something that was kind of a theme from that group. And then in our focus groups, it's really targeted at folks who are in the development community or working with utilities, working with the landfill. So very focused on those technical experts. The overall engagement approach is kind of what we're calling funneling. We're trying to be as broad as possible. And so the kind of broader engagement questions that we asked in this round were broad, right? They were a little bit more values-based because we wanted to hear from the community on the issues related to the moratorium. As we move into the next phase, that we will have much more detailed questions, detailed code language even for folks to be participating in. So I would say it was, back to your question, Skippy, a broad group of people that were participating.
Were there any, cross sections or archetypes in the community that are obviously absent?
So I would say in the conversations that we had, I'm not sure that we hit families. That was a group that we didn't really see a lot of. We had hoped that we might get that with some of the neighborhood groups, but I think as a mom myself, your time is limited, and I think that was a group that maybe we didn't see in this round of engagement. But otherwise, it was, I feel like we saw most groups that we were looking for.
Just hearing that is a group that's, let's say, underrepresented, if not unrepresented, and we know it's a really important one to everyone here. Is it possible to, hand select a few emissaries, the, kind of 5 representatives, and, and just make sure we're getting that feedback?
Yeah, and I think that is where we're moving in this next round of engagement. As we get into some of the more specific detail, we'll be trying to target communications with folks, so making sure that we are hearing from as broad a group as possible. Can't force everyone to participate, but we really are trying to be open and target those groups that we've heard from, and to your point, that we maybe missed.
Got it.
I think in addition to the families.
I don't know you guys are representatives of that, but you're probably trying to keep church and state.
Indeed. I don't get to have an opinion. The relative to their size or sort of portion of the population, I think your average resident homeowner, and whether they're free market or affordable. And one commentary that I heard in private interviews, because you get a very different outcome, and you get a different section of people, because you're sort of hand selecting them, to use your phrase, was on this particular topic, a fear of making publicly visible or recordable comments about something that could be perceived as affecting their friend or their neighbor or their coworker's bottom line. And it is about money, just to put a fine point on it. Numerous people were concerned about participating in a public way and taking a position publicly on something, even if it's a dot on a board, that could be perceived as affecting their contractor buddy's business or their broker buddy's next sale. And that is, I think, an important dynamic to bring to the fore, that these are monetary conversations that we're having. There's a direct relationship between value and regulatory response, and that value translates into people's livelihoods. And that was real. That was something we experienced for sure.
And I would say I had a few conversations with folks in the real estate community, and they said, I will talk with you if you don't put my name down. You're not recording my comments. I'm just having a conversation with you. And it's that same fear that it's going to impact their livelihood because their client might hear that they're saying something. So I don't know that we get over that, but these are conversations that we'll continue to have, and keep confidence as best as we can.
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly had a couple handfuls of conversations with people who are in that bucket as well. And I know I don't have to say this for you guys to do it, but, kind of just really challenge you to find a way to break through that because, while we can certainly, make decisions up here without that feedback, it's important for us. And, even if it's anonymized or whatever, I think it's important for us within our own headspace, but also to justify to the community the decisions we've landed at. So I think that'll be super, super helpful. Two more questions here. So this is really for you, Philip, Ben. Of all the thoughts you guys heard, solutions and policy proposals, not sort of, general thoughts that came forward, was there anything that really made you stop and rethink something that you felt firm in, or was a totally new idea that you hadn't considered that you think will move forward?
I can speak to a couple things. I think in the planning world writ large, outside of Aspen, I think the place when people think of zoning and they think of dimensional limitations on things, in a lot of other communities, when you have that conversation, of course there's value in the real estate market and a square foot matters, and everybody keeps track of value per square foot. But I think over and over again, whether it was from architects or whether it was from planners or whether it was from people in the real estate community, I think that, and we brought this to you in the last work session that we were with you, I think that just the intensity of value that is sitting in a square foot of real estate and the implications of that in all kinds of business decisions for all kinds of firms and all kinds of folks in our community, I think that translated directly into our recommendation to try to find alternatives to reducing square footage. Like that was something that in my world, 300 square feet, doesn't necessarily change the fundamental nature of a home, but I think in the, across the whole context that we're working in, 300 square feet on an individual property is a lot for people, and we came to a clear sense that was going to be an insurmountable point of contention if we went after it. So that was one thing. The other thing that I think I've heard a lot of comments about is as we try to get into solutions to this that are not about cutting square footage is incentivizing versus disincentivizing and the nature of those kinds of solutions and what's effective and what's not. And again, I think in a normal economy, when you start doing things as Aspen's done, like building ADUs and giving additional square footage to duplexes, those are incentives to get people to do things. And what we've come to find out in this economy, and a lot of the comments that we heard from folks bore out, is like, well, you can try to build an incentive around this, but those incentives don't mean the same thing here that they would in a normal residential market. And so, like landing on what those incentives might be, I think would be we've got some things that we're thinking about and are going to be proposing to you folks, particularly around demolition and some of the other things, but it's a really difficult thing to try to land on appropriately here, and we've tried to do that in Aspen's past, and some of that's been effective and some of it hasn't. And, you know, we heard varying comments from people about whether or not incentivizing is the thing to really shift the needle. And I'm still trying to think about that.
I understand. Perennial question in my business too. How do you incentivize people that have everything, right?
To add to that, a couple of things that gave me a moment's pause, speaking with members of the development community, with respect to incentives, time is more valuable than money.
Yeah. Well, time is money.
And with respect to how development works, there's a degree to which the land use code and community development and our sister development review agencies' processes influence both. And that gives us, I think, as an organization, a tremendous amount of influence over getting the outcomes that the community seeks from development. And but hearing that over and over again, that time's more valuable than money, in this context is, I think, really instructive. And second, and I heard this more than once, which makes me think that maybe it's legitimate, is that ADUs on free market properties can work. And you know, the conventional wisdom for the last 15 years
at least,
is that the ADU program with the voluntary occupancy deed restriction didn't work. And what I heard numerous times was ADUs with a mandatory occupancy deed restriction could work. And there are people who are very interested in providing their mitigation that way, which they're presently not allowed to do. And so, you know, that's not a moratorium project. That's sort of outside of the scope, but it's something for us that as we think about how to empower council and the community to be more creative in how affordable housing is delivered and where in our community, that might be a conversation that we can put back on the table, which was exciting to me.
Yeah, but the reason that ADUs are no longer allowed in Aspen is because we were not able to force any sort of occupancy. So someone could say, I'm doing an ADU, it's my mitigation, and then never, ever rent it out. There was no mandatory rent or category or anything like that. It's a private, single-family residence, and that ability to force its actual occupancy was a failure. I mean, it's just not legal. And so the vast majority were turned into TV screening rooms or wine cellars.
Yeah.
And that's why it's just extra FAR for someone to build and not use.
And when pushed back on precisely that,
Yeah.
these respondents said, no, put the ADUs in the APSHA system.
Yeah, but again, I think that when we talk to our attorneys in the past, at least, it has been, you really can't
Sure.
do that onto someone's
I'm-
single-family home.
I'm just conveying the sentiment.
Yeah.
But
That's interesting.
not the legal position on the deed restrictions.
Yeah.
I think that an overarching theme that I heard kind of along these lines is that more options for affordable housing in more places is a good thing.
Right.
Sure.
And that there are many ways to, you know, crack that nut, so to speak. It could be a zoning thing, it could be an ADU thing, it could be, you know, doing public-private partnerships, it could be, you know, adjusting the housing credits market, lots of different things. And I think, again, there's things that are dealt with in the moratorium and things that come afterwards, but there's a lot of really rich ideas, I think, coming from the community feedback that is really worth exploring in the coming months.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. And
Can
Jump
I
in?
just, for just a half second? You know, I think it'd be worth looking at how many ADUs the city approved in the past and how many are actually being used for any sort of housing now. Because if you took the mitigation dollars that those people would have paid, we'd have some units. But instead, there's probably been, you know, dozens, if not hundreds, of homes that were built in Aspen with an ADU that never housed anybody.
Yeah.
You know, and I think I just don't want to repeat mistakes. And the thing is, you can think something's legal until someone with enough money takes it to the Supreme Court to say, this was forced upon me, I wasn't given a fee in lieu option, and I'd like that deed restriction removed, and you lose your zoning case. So those things happen. I mean, I just want to make sure that if we embark on a program, it stays there. Thank you. And it's used for how it's intended.
yeah, I appreciate that. And I think, you know, I mean, to your point that we want, or the community wants and understands for affordable housing to be mixed all over, I don't know that legal background. Certainly, we wouldn't pursue that unless we thought that was something that could change definitively. But, you know, if it did, to have affordable housing sprinkled through residential neighborhoods is kind of exactly the community mix we're hoping to get back to. And, you know, I've long said, if we did nothing on affordable housing now and we just let the sort of town die as it currently is, what we'll end up with is ADUs everywhere, because every billionaire who has $100 million sunk into their home is not going to give up on that investment. They're going to put their private chef in their home, and they're just going to keep running it as a country club. So we'll get there one way or the other. And I hope not the latter way. Okay, those are my questions. The last question, Tori, it might be for you, but you guys had thought about putting numbers to this and goals, and that's something that we're working on. We kind of like did our homework or whatever, and I was just wondering when that's happening in relation to this, because I originally thought we were supposed to have that conversation in early March, but do you know when that is?
I don't know when that's coming back.
Do you guys know?
I'm not quite following.
The housing, the housing homework that we took home one day.
So we're supposed to have an upcoming
The
meeting.
Affordable Housing Strategic Plan?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
we were asked to do our homework as a basis to start having a conversation about a goal, and I just wondered about the timing, because I initially thought that was early March, and it may or may not flow with
No.
those needs.
Skippy,
appears
I
that
think
the-
some of us only got our homework in last week on that. and
I'll
I
let the
heard
city
that it was
manager's
taking a while
office-
to get all homework.
I'll let the city manager's office speak to that process a little bit.
Okay, I'm just throwing out that for those people, there may or may not be a conversation.
I see a hand up
Yeah.
on Ms. Ott's.
Sarah, did you have some timing information for that?
Certainly, we just received the last council members' input late last week on the homework. And so we're scheduling the housing strategic plan for adoption at either your last meeting in April or your first meeting in May. Thank you.
Does that mean do I look up in this scenario? Does that mean we talk about it at work sessions first and then it gets adopted then, or do we talk about it at the same time we adopt it?
We don't really see additional discussion points from a staff perspective because there's been 2 work sessions already. And so the information that will be presented for adoption is the assimilation of the individual council member input.
Oh, okay, got it. So you'll make a recommendation based on our input we can talk about. Okay, great. Please and thank you. Okay, those are my questions. To your comment about kind of, you know, influx of people and new perceptions and that, obviously we're not going to do that now, but if there is, you know, remaining budget or that, I think it's super beneficial, you know. What I guess, you know, I've kind of had the tension in my own experience of like, having the fear of so many new people, perspectives, you know, what does that mean for the town and its soul and its ethos, and yet, you know, pretty much everyone I've actually sat down and talked to and gotten to know who moves here, their first thing is like, oh my God, I love this place. How do I get involved and kind of find my footing? And they really want to invest in the town, which is a beautiful thing. So my fear might not match the reality of what's there. And I think, you know, there's always been newcomers. I was a newcomer. Tori was a newcomer before me. Rachel was even a newcomer. That's normal. And, you know, like when I do like, you know, self-development work at retreats, integration is always what comes after, and it's not a new normal. It's injecting a bit of RIT dye into the water and a new color emerges, but it just takes time. And I think, you know, our opportunity as locals who have been here and really care about this place is to be really intentional about that and to invite people in and to share what's happened, but really to listen too for what could be done differently or better. Because like kind of like the original newcomer in modern Aspen is like the Pepkas, and everyone thought that they were terrible at the time, right? Or not everyone, but certainly a lot of people. And now we kind of think what they brought in here was really magical. So, you know, there's always that out there as well. So I could even envision, you know, Acra's done the, you know, how to Aspen, but like a series on how we Aspen, right? Which is like a series of events where you watch a 10-minute little animated video on the history of affordable housing, and then there's a panel where it's just Q&A, and people get to really like ask and understand what's happened, but also give thoughts on what moving forward. And maybe there's one on that and one on transit and one on open space, one on the Aspen idea itself. But I could see those being a really beautiful thing, and I think it's our choice and our opportunity to like really open that up to our new residents, and I hope we do. So, yeah, I love that idea. Thank you for bringing that forward. Thanks. Gonna quick pee. I'll be back.
Before we, excuse me, I was just gonna say, before we move off of outreach, I want to thank Jessica for being here, and I just want to note for council that the design workshop team has been absolutely essential to our success on our engagement efforts, as well as a ton of the back of house research and code development work that we've been doing. And while she's here, I just want to embarrass her and say thanks.
Thanks, Philip. Thank you for that. Great, thank you.
And good to see you.
Good to see you. Anything else on the engagement?
Not for me. I think that it's been just, extremely robust. I think Ben said it well, but that he was actually surprised when he calculated 30 outreach engagement sessions. So I think it's a great job. This is a community-wide topic, and sounds like we're getting community-wide input. So I couldn't be happier. John?
Yeah, I just wanted to say I've been approached by a few constituents who apparently have negative experiences reaching out. Sorry. I just wanted to mention that I had several constituents that apparently had negative reactions reaching out to the city for help or as part of this outreach program. And based on what I'm reading in the packet, it seems like what Ben said earlier is true. If you haven't been able to engage, you haven't really been trying, because the opportunity is there. So thanks, Jessica, for your help in that.
Absolutely, and I would say if you're hearing from those folks, please direct them to Aspen Community Voice, that there's a wealth of information there, opportunities to engage there, and then we will be having another round of engagement in April.
As well as staff's direct contact information, including myself and Ben and other staff members, and we're available to speak with or meet with individual people to discuss whatever topic related to this that they want to talk about. So if our programming isn't getting them there, then our email address and phone number can.
Thanks for that.
Skippy?
I had one more thing that I'd forgotten. In sort of like this next round of outreach, just something you guys may already be asking about this, but as it kind of gets on the more technical side, I was reading in the comments a lot of stuff around buy downs. The interest in doing that, because it's a non-development option, but what I also thought was interesting was some of the feedback about why it would be more difficult here than other places, specifically restrictions in HOAs, and then obviously, assessment and HOA fees. So even if you could afford the place, could you do the ongoing? And it just got me thinking, because we're talking about underlying zoning allowances for development in residential, and clearly there's desire everywhere. So I had always thought about the development neutral program with the recipient being the home purchaser or the condo purchaser, right? And that should still be a thing going forward, but perhaps we really need to think about the land purchaser and the developer as that. So if there was, in this case, we're not at the point yet where there's a new revenue stream, but it's irrelevant because it still works, where like what would the numbers need to look like if we were to give a subsidy to the person who's buying the free market home, but they're going to redevelop it into 6 affordable housing units. If they were the recipient of that subsidy from new funding stream or existing funding stream, what would that look like for them, right? So instead of like, I want to buy a studio, I can't afford it, I get a 20% down payment assistance, okay, that gets me in, but now I have these HOA issues. Well, what if I wanted to go buy that $10 million lot, but I get that down payment assistance, but part of that agreement is I'm going to go develop that, by right with the max for that zone district as AH, and now there's like, does that make sense? So I would really like to check in with them during this next technical step to understand how that piece would work better.
And that is analysis that is ongoing, probably next week, with the design workshop team. So there are a few sets of kind of technical memorandum that we're working on right now. One is related to what are some zoning changes that would need to happen? How could you make basically the finances work to allow affordable housing and really allow it to be developed rather than just writing it into the zoning code and hoping, right? Hope is not a strategy. what would it actually take?
Right, exactly.
Right, and then an additional memo related to buy downs and what does that look like and what are kind of the finances around that, so you'll have that
Yeah,
information.
because then it's technically a buy down, but you end up with a whole new 100% affordable, and then you don't have any of those HOA issues and
Yeah.
stuff. So, cool.
Great.
Good work, guys.
I still see a hand up from Sarah. Sarah, I didn't know if that was a new hand or from before.
Sorry, I thought I'd put it down.
Ward's old hand.
Jessica, thank you again.
Ward's old hand's still there. Thank you.
Okay, everybody take a deep breath. This next topic gets a little technical, and so I'm happy to, kind of as always, kind of keep this pretty high level, but we do have some specific questions. This is, let me just get into this next. Okay. So demolition is a topic that I think we've focused in on through stakeholder outreach, talking to internal stakeholders within our sort of building engineering departments, looking at building permit data, conversations that we've had previously with City Council, projects that trigger what we call demolition, and we'll get into that calculation in a little bit more detail here in a few slides, but projects that trigger demolition, either they're major remodel projects that cross that threshold, or they're full scrape and replace projects where they're tearing down a full home and building up something entirely new. It's pretty clear in our analysis of building permits, and I think just walking around the community, that those are the kinds of projects that I think people are feeling most. And in our data, it seems like there's a clear trend that those are becoming much more frequent scenarios. And so as we, in our last work session with council, we made a fairly, I think, impactful decision to not go after a reduction of floor area either, really through any mechanism, but instead pursue a range of responses. And I think that the demolition response, along with the mitigation response, are the two most immediately impactful outcomes that I think we're pursuing. So we're not talking about the mitigation topic this evening. We're really focusing on this second topic of demolition. And when we talk about that, what are we responding to? How did we arrive at this? Well, first is a conversation, and we included a memo from an April 2021 discussion with council, where we've known for a while that the growth management quota system wasn't capturing this type of development and redevelopment through our allotment systems that has really defined GMQS for decades now. And when we look across town and, the residential construction scene feels more busy than ever, and you can stand on a corner in the West End and point to 4 major projects with construction fencing, at the intersection, and that's a situation you can replicate it in several areas of town right now. I think that this idea that this GMQS system that we've had that's really defined much of our land use context, again, for decades, it's just not capturing that. We also understand that these types of projects have really immense climate and waste impacts, and we know from the phone calls that we get at community development and that you get from neighbors that intensity of development and redevelopment is something that neighbors to these projects are feeling. And so our policy response that we're bringing to you this evening is a response to, I think, those three primary issues. As we have looked at this a little bit more directly, I think there's some questions that have arisen, and these are questions that I'm not asking you to answer at this point. I'll get to questions that I'm asking you to respond to at the end of the conversation, but for staff and for our consultant team, as we think about demolition, as we look into the residential development context, we respond to the issues that were initially raised in Ordinance 27 and restated in Ordinance 6. What are the driving forces in our residential development context? What are we feeling? What are we seeing? What are we seeing in the intensity of the building permit review? I think it's pretty clear that these projects of this scale are the things that people are feeling. When we look at building permits, the valuation of individual permits are going up significantly. That translates into more complex projects. It translates into more construction ways. It translates into more traffic coming up and down 82. All of the impacts that we've identified, it seems to be these really substantial, complicated projects that involve demolition or are full scrape and replace projects. The other question as we start to think about that, okay, so that's the thing that we're feeling and seeing. Using the system that we've had in place for a long time, there's been I think a good conversation happening about, is this redevelopment growth? You know, we've said before, our population is staying pretty static. The number of housing units is staying pretty static. When we think about growth, oftentimes those are measures that we often use. But is this redevelopment activity that we're seeing growth? And the reason that question is important is because we're going to be proposing dealing with this solution in our growth management quota system. So I think that question's fundamental. And then, if that's the case, and we see and feel all this stuff, what are the impacts that are created by this type of development? And certainly, I think we can rattle those things off. Physical infrastructure, human infrastructure, particularly around affordable housing, all of those things, I think we can start to make some pretty clear and direct lines to the impacts of these kinds of development to the things that we're seeing and feeling and the potential responses that we might be suggesting. This is where then the land use code becomes a pretty technical thing, and why I ask you to take a deep breath, because some of this does get into the weeds a little bit. The threshold that we have in the land use code is 40%, and it's a complicated calculation where we take the exterior surface area of roof structure and wall structures, and if you knock part of that down, you've got to stay underneath 40%. And if you cross 40%, there's all kinds of thresholds in other sections of the land use code around being able to continue a nonconformity, et cetera, et cetera. But as we've kind of looked at this both internally and talked to stakeholders, is that 40% threshold appropriate? And then connected to that is, do we measure demolition in the right way? And then if we are acknowledging that these projects are a part of our development reality and are going to be that way because we don't have new greenfield land on the fringes of Aspen that we're going to be turning into major subdivisions, this is the kind of activity that's going to define our residential context for some time. We're not going to be doing new subdivisions. And so what is it that we're going to be seeing? It's going to be more of this. And so what do we want to see from those kinds of projects? How could these projects be different or better as we look for kind of improvements to this aspect of our current development context? So as staff has envisioned this, the basic idea is this, is that we don't want to dismantle GMQS. We think it remains a important tool and set of tools for us to think about growth, to think about the impacts of growth. We have the other reason why we don't want to dismantle the growth management quota system or fundamentally reconform is it's built on some really important foundations that have been developed over time, calculations that have been developed over time about existing development and sort of appropriate levels of growth moving across years. Like, there's some really important studies and calculations and community decision-making that's been happened previously about what are appropriate levels of growth. So we don't want to get rid of that, but we want to try to think about how to deal with demolition within that system. And so the basic idea is that we create a new subcategory of allotments under the residential GMQS for projects that trigger demolition. Right now, we allow 19 residential allotments in a given year. And so the idea here is that we create a new subcategory under that. And of that 19, and we're still working on what that number should be, but some number of that 19 are limited to projects that trigger demolition. Yes.
I was just gonna ask, because you could be forgiven for walking down a block in the West End and thinking there's 19 per block sometimes. What is the number in the last couple of years?
What we're coming to understand is that, it probably feels that way because sometimes when you get a building permit, it's 3 or 4 years to completion, right?
Sure.
It seems pretty clear to us based on, and we need to verify some of this and make sure that where we're pulling our data is from is correct, but we think that there was kind of a baseline over about a 10-year period where there were 5 or 6 of these happening in a year. And so in the course of 3 years, it might feel like there's
Right.
15 or 18 of those happening in a given year. But on a given year, permits for 5 or 6 of these a year. The last couple of years, that number seems to be up around 14 or 15 a year. And so kind of a doubling or tripling kind of in the last 2 or 3 years. And I think that's translating into what we're feeling.
Got it.
And under our current code, those things go straight to building permit.
Yeah.
And there's not really any kind of review of them outside, making sure that they conform with underlying zoning and that they're meeting, the current building code.
Got it. And just one clarifying question.
Yeah.
So I understand we don't have a number yet, and I understand this process change, which I think is great and responds precisely to the time issue you were talking about in a good way. But if it's below the allotments, if the allotment's 5, do the first 5 also have a review, or those ones go straight to?
No.
It's just those after?
Yeah, so.
First come, first serve.
The second thing is that they would require getting an allotment, which under our current code would require going to P&Z or HPC, depending on where in town they're located.
Okay.
For projects that are triggering demolition. So a project that's crossing that 40% threshold from 41 to 100%, any of those projects would require an allotment and a review under P&Z or HPC. And then the other piece to that is that in that review, and this is where the real work is for us, is creating review criteria and performance standards. If you want to get an allotment, this is what your project needs to be doing.
Great.
And I just want to hover on that for a second. Excuse me. We have been having conversations with you as a group for years now about these various topics, about the pace and scale of development, about growth management and the allotment system, about solid waste, right? We're totally different members of staff having conversations with you about solid waste, about water conservation and the utilities department. In our estimation, this response is not only the most sort of surgical response that we can come up with in our existing regulatory framework to deal with that many issues, which in the language in Ordinance 6 was our charge. It is also, to Ben's comment a moment ago, the most direct way to get at the type of development that we're currently seeing in town and that we can expect to see in the future in the community. And I just want to highlight that because I feel really strongly relative to the range of responses that we could have taken to these different issues, this is simultaneously the sort of most impactful and the most efficient that we can come up with. And I think it's important to understand that.
Yeah, thank you. I got that strongly from the memo as well, and I appreciate you reiterating for our viewing public and things like this. I mean, when you look at that, most of the new construction is demolition, remodel, construction, and none of that is subject to any form of GMQS. It's like closing the barn door while there's a side door that's wide open for, letting the horses out. So I think it is time to look at this. I really appreciate, I think, the time that you've put into this with the public outreach and then looking at our code has really shown up where the fatal flaws are now, what has become the fatal flaw. And as many have said before, it used to be your job generation and growth was commercial and retail. There certainly is enough of that left, but the real generation is now coming from residential. And, when I read through this, I don't know if you had more than 1, 2, 3 you want to show us first, or you're just taking some comments now.
Well, we've got more to talk about, but in terms of the basic idea, this is it.
Yeah, well, I'm really in full agreement. I can see where there need to be a lot of things worked out. And in particularly, I'm imagining it's a points type of program, so it would be a competition to get your demolition permit, potentially, if it's like mirroring GMQS for residential growth. So, I could see things like getting more points for having your housing on site, really high points for that, as opposed to I'm doing housing credits, points for going beyond what might be required by the calculation of mitigation. That, you want to bump up to the top of the line. When you're in a GMQS in the county, you say, okay, I'm going to provide more open space than would be required. I'm going to provide more than what your minimum would be, and that's how I'm going to bank my points to be able to get to the top of the competition. I think it's going to be very important to make it actually competitive. If there's anything that growth management competition scoring has lost over the years, is the competitiveness, because the allotments have been too high and no one really has to compete. No one ever puts anything extra. You hit the bare minimum threshold for points to pass, and that's good enough because there's no competition. So for me, that this has to be a program that creates competition. And I don't know if that means that there is a limited amount of FAR available each year for demolition permits, or if the FAR is related to the lot size and the competition is separate from the amount of FAR that the county, the P&Z, the city, or the planning and zoning might be approving in a given year. I don't know how those things really play out, but I'm sure you're starting to give it
Do
some
you
thought.
want to respond to that specifically?
So I will, I also, again, I'm wondering whether, thinking about growth and growth management, there's always some side ways on the program, and I'm not sure I want to advance any. But when you think about house size in the county, you had a basic size, and then you could buy TDRs without competing in GMQS for that. Should someone be able to buy higher up into the demolition archive or the process, again, by going well above and beyond what might be a basic? So those are just some thoughts I had reading the memo. Thank you.
That was awesome. Yeah, such great ideas, Rachel. I really like that. It just raised a few other little side ideas in this sort of points thing, just to kind of get your minds going, not saying this has to be the thing, but from like little things that are impactful, like Tori talks about on HPC projects, having, plaques that describe the history, right? Like, is something like that a point where you work in that stuff that you want in the community? The other thing that popped into my head, back when I was younger and had, let's say, a legally spotty driving record, my insurance company used to give me points for taking safety courses, right? Like, you demonstrate to us you're doing your homework and improving your driving, we're going to reduce your rates. So when you were talking about that education piece, I wondered, could you get points for like taking community education and history classes or participating in something? I don't know, but just kind of wanted to get your brains activated in those areas. I drive great now, by the way.
This wasn't
Legally.
This isn't a question. While we're on the topic and have heard from a couple of you on the idea, this wasn't a question. We're thinking about the ways in which to sort of bring forward these performance standards and review criteria for these projects. I mean, is there general consensus? And this used to be much more fundamental to GMQS, and it went away. And I think there's some reasons why it went away, but we used to rely heavily on points. Is that something to sort of re-explore as a way to sort of get at this?
I don't know the history, and I don't want to say I understand all the trade-offs. You can educate me as needed, but the way Rachel described it, it sounded very attractive and a really smart way to approach it. So I liked what Rachel said, so yes, unless you tell me otherwise.
Okay. Yeah, the question was a little bit out of order, but while we're on the topic.
We just happen to have a resource in the room who can provide us with information on
Please step to the podium.
the expiration of the point system and the history behind that.
So I believe that the point system was removed in the 2006 moratorium. And the conversation at that time was, let's right-size the allotments and make sure that that's kind of reflective of what we want to see in terms of growth in the community, and have it be much more objective, because the point system felt, at least at that time, very subjective. In the original iteration of growth management, you could get points for having a dentist office or for having a childcare facility. And I think over the years, businesses change, and so a building that maybe got points for the dentist's office doesn't have a dentist's office anymore. And so the value of the points as they were kind of in place at that time just didn't really feel appropriate. The criteria that exist now in the code that is maybe kind of point-like is in the essential, not essential public facility, in the multi-year development allotment section. That is a review that goes to city council, and I think there's like 12 or 14 different criteria, and those are a little bit more subjective, but you would have to meet them in terms of we're providing economic development for the community. We're providing maybe lodging units that are meeting a specific need. So it's not like you have this thing and you get a point. It's more of a conversation, and it's only for that one review, feeling like that's an additional ask, and so it made sense when we updated that code language to have a review with council.
And from a program administration standpoint, the more subjectivity you have embedded in the regulations, the more complicated it becomes, the more contentious it becomes, and I would suggest also the more open to legal challenge it becomes. And from staff's perspective, how we've conceived of this to this point is more of a zone it like you mean it approach. We think there should be 10, just pulling a number out of the air, there should be 10 of this particular development type allotments per year. And we're going to assign performance standards to that around solid waste management, around energy efficiency and water efficiency performance for the subsequent development, around affordable housing, excuse me, and meeting your affordable housing obligations as prescribed by the code. And in our view, the further we get from that, zone it like you mean it, the more complicated things become. And we also hear that there's tremendous benefits to having those options. One piece of feedback I've heard twice in private interviews was in response to this concept that overperformance maybe doesn't change anything in terms of competing for an allotment, but perhaps overperformance can get you an allotment in a year where there isn't one. So if you're going to really show up for the community and do something big over and above how we zoned it, maybe you can get an allotment after the allotments have been used for a year. Just another idea to kind of put into the thinking.
Yeah, I can understand times change and things change. And Jessica, when you're speaking about it, it sounded a lot like more commercial points than residential. But, I guess my main point is that whatever the allotment has been, we haven't hit it. It's been way too big for too long, and so nobody puts anything special into a project to compete. And that's what's really been a failure of the system. And so I hate the term right-sized, because I don't know if you mean it's going to be right-sized enough to have created demand and competition, or is it going to be right-sized enough that we accommodate every demolition request every year? They just now have to do more housing. So, that's what you'll have to come back to us with. And again, I was kind of assuming that we were going back as a quota system. It's some sort of allotment total cap that's meaningful and isn't just we'll do 500 houses a year, but we never do that many, and that's kind of where we're at now. Thank you.
I appreciate that background and history. Certainly, squidgy, subjective, out-of-date standards are challenging, but just because we've had those before doesn't mean we have to have them in the future. So I don't see the zoning it as you mean it and a point system as mutually exclusive at all. It's about, making sure they're the right point system. I love the idea of a competition to uphold our values and goals as a community. And I think we just have to be mindful of how we set those criteria. And I think we have to have a sort of required look back of some kind. It's just it's the norm for any organization to keep coming up with new rules and forget to go back and sweep out the stuff that's not working anymore. And so, whether it's a biannual or whatever, if we're going to go that direction, and I like that idea a lot, I think we just need to have built into that structure, house cleaning, basically.
Yeah, and there used to be the requirement, it was a biannual application, and then it changed to a first come, first serve, right? And so there's pros and cons there, but it does create more of a feel of a competition when you go to, you can apply on January 1st and on July 1st, and that's it. So, something I think to consider as we move forward on policy ideas.
Cool.
Just one other thing, I think, from reading the memo that you'll have to think about. It doesn't have to be answered now. But, I've seen brand-new homes torn down in this community. And hopefully they'll be deconstructed in the future. But should a home have had some prior mitigation in recent years, is there going to be some way of taking credit for that, even though they're now doing so much more, there's new mitigation? But I'll just leave it where it is and let you guys think about it. But if somebody has, well, wait a second, I mitigated a 0.45 in 1999. Is that the same as where they are now? And how is there either credit given or some necessary of that, whereas we're still going to the new level?
Rachel, that's a great question, and we have contemplated that. We've got a tabled ordinance 24 that talks about mitigation, and we've got an update to our residential generation study that contemplates those kinds of things. So more to come on that, but it's certainly something we're thinking about.
Thank you.
Okay, so we've already talked a little bit about this, but there's some other things in here that we haven't talked about yet. Certainly, we chose this path as being responding to a lot of different things that we were hearing for these reasons. One, we think that it acknowledges the impacts of this type of development within GMQS. That's something that we've already talked a little bit about. It serves as a really important trigger for other requirements in the code around nonconformities, around affordable housing mitigation. And we do think that this would have the effect of pacing the impacts of these projects. Again, there's been a big jump the last couple of years. We've had huge numbers of real estate transactions in this community in the last 3 years, and we think that we're going to start seeing those transacted properties pursuing these kinds of land use applications and projects, in the coming years. And so we do think that pacing these things has some real merit. And then lastly, we want to allow the attachment of heightened performance standards and review criteria to these kinds of projects, and we currently don't have the capacity to do that. And just as an effort to respond to the impacts that they're having to several of the topics that we've talked about in Ordinance 27 and 6. Again, a couple of these things we've also discussed during the conversation. This is the work that we're going to have to do between staff and the consultants. Firstly, we need to arrive at a defensible number of demolition allotments. We're working on improving the demolition calculation methodology, talking both internally and externally with the people who do this for a living to make sure that what we're proposing aren't going to create unintended consequences. One of the examples, just to give you, is right now we don't count fenestration or windows, but with the new architecture that's coming forward and we have whole walls that are windows, right now if you go to replace those windows, it wouldn't, or reconfigure them or tear them down, it wouldn't count as demolition. We're going to be bringing that into the equation, just as an example. We need to arrive at review criteria and performance standards. We have really good friends in the environmental health department here that are experts in waste and experts in energy performance, and we're relying heavily with them to give us some best practices in this area and things that we might build into these performance standards. We do need to create a new process and procedure in GMQS. We're taking something that's currently is being done by right and turning it into a board review and an issuance of allotments and talking about things of when you can submit an application. Those are things that we've got to be pretty thoughtful about to get right. And then lastly, this term demolition, whether it's with a capital D, I know this sounds absurd, but the land use code has demolition capital D and demolition lowercase d, and we also have the word destroy. And across the land use code, the confusion of those terms creates difficulty both for staff and for the design community. So this is where we've got some specific, just to make sure that as we come forward to you with some potential code amendments, that we're reflecting your thinking on these topics. And some of these things have already been discussed this evening. But the first two questions we'll handle together, and then I've got 4 others. I think I had 5 in the memo, but I broke one of those questions into 2 for the purposes of the discussion this evening. But firstly, does council view scrape and replace or major remodel projects in the residential context as growth? Again, you know, growth can be understood by different people, honestly, and we've heard various perspectives on this topic. And from council's perspective, do you see this kind of development as growth?
Yes.
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 I'm going to say yes, but I think you should expand the term growth. Thank you, Amy. I'm going to say growth, but I think it's also growth and impact.
Yeah.
You know, that's a little more of what you see, you know, between the construction vehicles for 2 or 3 weeks, or 2 or 3 years, excuse me. You know, the new job services and things like that. So, you know, growth might be too limiting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I appreciate the question, and we do have a chapter in the land use code called impact fees.
Yeah.
And so, but the main proposal here is to bring this discussion into the growth management system. And so I do think it's important for us, if we're going to be pursuing this policy, to have,
Yes.
I think, consensus around the idea of growth.
And I really appreciate that. I think Rachel brings up a great point there, and it is part of the conversation that's going on in the community as people say growth. What do you mean? No, growth is not just population growth. And I think that's a good distinction and a fine point. But yes, impact growth is definitely, so yes, I think you heard from all of us, yes on the one.
Thank you. And then lastly, on this page, I've got more for you. Do you like this idea of using these kinds of demolition projects to get an allotment through GMQS, that basic idea of that? Is that something that makes sense to you structurally as you guys understand the land use code?
My answer's a little longer on this one, but it starts with a yes. So you guys can go first.
Okay. It makes sense to me. I can support the direction that you're bringing on this. It makes a lot of sense.
Yes.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense to me as well. And I think part of it is, you know, again, that process for allotment and how does it occur? And if someone is mitigating beyond their actual impacts, you know, that's a real plus. Thank you.
The answer is yes. I really like how you guys are thinking about this. It neatly fits into zoning it like we mean it for what we want. The one thing that we've talked about before that comes up, and I don't know if or how you address this, but you know, it is an unintended consequence, but it is an accepted consequence that, you know, all of these rules will continue to increase prices, which actually is a benefit to our development community. So if you're listening, this will help. But there is still a very small subsection of properties in Aspen who might be naturally occurring affordable, you know, primarily mobile, and if ever tiny homes happen somewhere, I think about those. And so just the question is, how are we mindful of those 2 small carve-outs in such a way that we are not extinguishing the very last naturally occurring affordable?
And just one quick response to that, we think that by, you know, if you were to demolish and turn something into new, it immediately increases value. And we do think that one of the outcomes to this is that we make both the incentives and the disincentives enough to kind of stay below that 40% threshold, that we're going to have less things torn down, that we're going to have hopefully more structures that still have usable life left in them and are still perfectly functional, to not have people tear them down. And maybe that's a maybe a hopeful outcome but we think a potential outcome of these policies.
I hear that, and as we're learning on the APSHA side, right, 27 years or whatever on a mobile home, and at some point, you're not replacing the walls in your mobile home, you got to replace it. And so, the extra time in this application process, which, maybe is $100,000 on a $20 million home, it's not even a bother, but on something like that, it can be the difference between someone being able to live there or not. And we have some longtime Aspenites who are still living in those properties, so just to be mindful, that's all.
One of the issues that's come to the fore for me, and starting in our council packets after this meeting, but subsequent council packets, we're going to provide council with a matrix of sort of post-moratorium projects, ideas that have come up that aren't necessary to be done under Ordinance 6, but that have merit and are aligned with comments we've gotten from council and the public. One of the things that's going to be on that list is some policy work and frankly some sort of philosophical exploration about how we continue to respond to what I'll call the locals economy versus the sort of visitor real estate economy, because those are two very different things. And from a legal standpoint, we are by and large required to have one rule set for all of them, and that's where it becomes challenging for us to use your phrase, be mindful of the naturally occurring affordable housing. Try to be, and there's a degree to which we are legally required not to be. And so I feel like there's some exploration and some creativity and some policy work that can be done in the coming years around where we can better respond to and how we can better respond to those, be it through the APSHA guidelines or the land use code or some mechanism we haven't conceived.
Well, and I think this is also the deferral program.
Yeah.
It's really,
That's precisely what I'm
it's
talking
really
about.
much talk,
Yeah. No, that's totally fair. And, there's kind of like two ways to arrive at a sculpture, as John could tell you, right? You have an additive process where you add little bits and you only want some on that side. And there's another way you just get the block and you start shaving. And so maybe it's just that we need to do the latter. We need the block first and then we can kind of work back. That's really in your guys' court. But nonetheless, to put it out there as important and for our community to know that we're thinking about that.
Great. Thank you.
Did I get art right?
This takes that last idea and asks a little bit more specific question. Do you agree with the idea of creating a fixed number of these kinds of projects? So not just an allotment that you have to go through a process, but there's a limited number of them that we'll be making some proposals around what that number is, but just the idea that that number is fixed.
yes.
Yes, and I would I want to see the homework on this because I really have no idea what the number should be.
Yeah, and I will just say that it's difficult to get at, and there's going to be some manual labor in this because sometimes you need to go actually into a building permit and look at their demo calculations to
If it has
identify.
2 decimal places, I'll be concerned.
Well, I know that sounds absurd, Skippy, but but we sometimes get into those
average,
that level of
yeah.
detail. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And then again, there's been some support for this, but just to sort of get it from the four of you, review criteria and performance standards associated with these allotments. Again, all the other kind of allotments that we have currently, a lot of those performance standards, certainly that point system has gone away. There's not really a competition. And so we would be bringing that concept back to this type of development specifically.
Yes, with the look back for iteration.
Yeah.
Yes, unless you've come up with another better way to deal with it.
It'll be some variation of, I think, what we're all talking about.
Cool.
And on this last one, again, getting into the sort of moratorium work versus post-moratorium work, I'll point to the WELLS program, the Water Efficient Landscaping program that utilities and engineering run, as an example of where I think some of the performance standards may end up going, particularly with respect to solid waste and energy and water. And that's that the land use code can provide a trigger and a regulatory framework for compliance with standards that may live outside of the land use code. And so we haven't fully baked this yet, but you may very well be reviewing ordinances that require people to participate in programs like WELLS that require further development in order to put in place. And that work, again, would extend beyond the moratorium. And that work would also critically involve the direction of the utilities department, the engineering department, climate action, and environmental health in order to make sure that we can structure those in a way that are commensurate with best practice, with our organizational needs, with budget, and in working with relevant agencies like Picken County if it's the landfill, and Core if it's energy efficiency. And I would add too that the building code is going to be another example, which you'll be seeing later this year. Another example of something that will have tie-ins to the land use code amendments that you'll be reviewing later, but won't actually include that work until some point after the moratorium's expired.
And a little bit more detail on that. I think at least a couple of you were involved in the passage of our small cell wireless design guidelines. The way that whole sort of system kind of developed over time, and it took us a little bit of time to do so. We did a code change that brought in place a new process and procedure. We created some basic design guidelines for them to get them in place, so that we knew that if a project was coming through, they'd at least be subject to these things. And then we spent a little bit more time after that to do the kind of robust set of design guidelines that we currently have in place that live outside the land use code. So this is not something that we don't have kind of other examples of in the relationship to the land use code. And it gives time for us to really be thoughtful about what those ultimate guidelines or requirements are going to be to get one of these allotments. So more to come on that, but that's kind of where our thinking is on this.
Awesome.
Does council desire that the approval of a demolition allotment be subject to review by P&Z or HPC?
Yes.
And again, right now it's by right. We have administrative processes where we could do an administrative allotment issuance. This question asks about the benefit of a board review for someone to get to an allotment.
Yeah, it's yes for me. I mean, the community's clearly saying that these are projects that have impact, and so the community should be able to review them.
Unless, I'm trying to understand, Ben, will they be looking at the demolition and the new structure at the same time, or just the one without the other? So it's really not just the demolition.
It is not.
And my answer is yes.
Yeah, not in our conception of things as it is right now. That
Okay.
And
Demolition and what's going to replace it is reviewed kind of
and
together, so then my answer is yes.
there also might be some benefit to applicants to this as well.
Yeah.
Because right now, and I'm going to use the wireless submission as an example again. Right now, to submit a small cell wireless, you've got to submit simultaneously the land use code requirements, all the kind of FCC requirements and everything. You've got to submit the details of your building permit. You've got to submit the details of your right-of-way permit. And all that's coming in as a single application package. And we then sort of give an approval for the project if it meets all of our criteria. It might be that the building permit and the right-of-way permit are not issued. In fact, we've got approvals in place, but we haven't issued a single right-of-way or building permit yet for one of our wireless facilities. But the point is, once we get to that point, it's going to be a much more cursory response for the building permit and the right-of-way permit, because we already did that review for that project at the time of the land use application. And so I think while this would be a new level of review for these kinds of projects, it might be that we can get projects to a better place earlier on in their design process, so that their building permit process is much shorter and more efficient once they get into it. So if I was a member of the development community, I might be listening to this and like, oh my gosh, this is going to add 6 months to my project timeline. But I do think that it could have some effect of getting projects earlier on in their design to a place where the building permit process is not quite as lengthy, because they've got a better project at the beginning.
I'm a yes on that.
I'm a yes.
This is the last question, and I put a warning up there in red. Because that 40% threshold is really important. But But you can also do a really extensive remodel on a house. You can basically build a brand-new house and stay under 40% threshold, okay? So as we've thought about this, currently, the building department, as they're reviewing building permits, they have what's called a level 3 alteration, where if you're not touching anything on the outside of the building, but you're going in and you're touching at least 50% of the interior, that you're messing, they call it 50% of work area, that triggers a compliance in the building code with a whole set of standards that if you were staying under the 50%, you would not be subject to. But these would be projects that are like significant interior remodel, but aren't doing much on the outside. And we see a lot of those. Similarly, our engineering department, if you cross that 50% threshold, using the same calculation that the building department uses, you're required to upgrade all of your storm management, storm management systems on your property. This is asking for projects that, and this might be a post-moratorium topic, but it's come up in our conversation in outreach with the development community internally, is if we have a project that is significant,
Bless you.
is significant to cross those 50% thresholds at the building department and engineering department, but is not so significant that it crosses our 40% demolition threshold in the land use code, do we want to also subject those lower impact projects that are just crossing that 50% threshold towards, construction and demolition waste standards that we don't currently have in place? And again, you could have, these are things that would be like an interior gut of a house where you got a lot of stuff that you're throwing into the landfill potentially, but aren't crossing that 40% threshold that we're using for these allotments in this whole other system.
Rachel?
Yeah, I would like to tackle this.
Okay.
And it seems to me that, construction waste is measured in cubic yards and the, size of the container you order to be outside the place. Perhaps there's a cubic yard measurement, of how much waste that this is supposed to do.
Yeah.
And then you'll get some sort of sense. But if it's heading towards the end of the life of the landfill, almost all of it counts, and these are things that are not compostable or not whatever. So I would have to say, yes, I think that there should be some sort of, minimus threshold where no, it doesn't matter. But overall, my answer is yes. And given the earlier comment that you hope to kind of standardize or clean up some of these demolition definitions that are in various codes so we don't run into conflicts in the future, this is a great starting point to think about what that should be. What should be the threshold upon which, yes, they kick in, and no, it's only 2 trash cans worth of waste, they did the job themselves type thing is different from someone who's going to have, a whole construction trailer dumped out 2 times a week while they're doing this. So, I think the answer is yes. And while I don't have a firm opinion about it, if looking at whether 40% is the right standard for demolition or should it be lower, I'd be willing to take a look at it with the right backgrounding, pros and cons. Thank you.
Yeah, I support this. I think, as you pointed out, I think as we enact more of these new restrictions, these new rules, whatever we want to call them, we probably will see more of these level 3 alterations. And I think, our goal is to reduce construction waste and have development pay its own way. And I think this is a step in the right direction on both of those. Thanks.
Just to clarify, the additional performance standards you're talking about in this scenario are limited to those around demolition and waste? Okay. Then in that case, I am also supportive. And to Rachel's about, is 40 the right number? I don't know, but I'm certainly happy to look at it.
Also, just to be clear, the other performance standards would be triggered by the things themselves.
And just on that topic, and very quickly, when we initially kind of conceptualized this, we were also going to be talking about energy performance standards. And in conversations internally, particularly with our building permit reviewers, the nature of things and the nature of the market here, it seems that when people are doing that kind of level of interior remodel, that they're doing the things around energy performance stuff already, and that the real difference, I think, was the construction and demolition waste. That the projects that are doing this, they're putting in new windows, they're putting in new appliances, they're putting in new HVAC systems, and you know, trying to get as much insulation in the walls and the roof as possible. So we decided on this question to really focus on the construction and demolition waste, because on projects that are like this, our sense is that they're already kind of pursuing those energy performance upgrades.
And the amended existing building code that is in place now in the city is industry-leading with respect to energy efficiency. And when you see the next iteration of adopted building codes, the amendments developed by our staff for energy efficiency for existing buildings will again be industry-leading. And moving in, to use I think Nick Thompson's language, moving as close to net zero as the IBC is allowing us to move without just making it mandatory. So we feel really strongly, again, about the position we're taking with respect to energy efficiency.
Cool, excellent.
Happy to take any further discussion or questions on this topic of demolition in quotes. And again, that seems absurd, but thus is the nature of the land use code as it's currently formulated. Demolition with a capital D is a very specific term within the code. And,
Big D and little d can make
Big D
big
and little
differences
d.
in political conversations too.
That's true. That's true. That's very true. Thank you for that connection.
Any further?
No.
Thank you for the very clear direction this evening.
Thanks, guys.
And with the feedback we've received from the community and stakeholders to this point, with the feedback we've gotten from council to this point, as we've suggested with our timelines over the last couple of months, we are at an inflection point where we are starting to draft ordinances. And there's some more short-term rental work to be done, both at this table and out in the community, and we're doing that. That's sort of running on a parallel track to this work. And so you'll see me and some of the short-term rental team again on April 11th for a work session where we're going to summarize some information, and I think again later in April for a sort of outreach summary and recommendations discussion with council. But with respect to the residential side of things, the next time you see us is going to be reviewing reports produced by the consultants, reviewing second round outreach summaries, and discussing this content in the form of draft ordinances. And so we're really excited to dig into that work, and we're really grateful for the feedback we've gotten from council to this point on that.
Thank you for your light speed work.
John?
I just want to thank you guys and all Deb for the hard work you've been doing and the presentation tonight. You've clearly listened to us here at this table, and also thanks to Design and Workshop. The outreach, I think, was way more involved than I had any idea. Hundreds of people have participated. That's very reassuring to me. Thanks.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, as always, to Grassroots. And let's see, no meeting tomorrow?
I'm really excited about the
travels.
agenda tomorrow, actually. I think it's going to be great. Looks really streamlined.
Clean.
Bye, Al.